Welcome back to Crime Time Inc., and today we are reviewing the last of 4 Reith lectures from the BBC by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gwynne Adshead.
Oh yeah, this one's a particularly interesting one. It was delivered in Bergen, Norway.
In Norway,
Yeah, and
land of the midnight sun,
exactly, and they have this reputation for,
pre-Vikings.
doing things a little differently, especially with their justice system.
Yeah.
When it comes to emphasizing, well, like you said, rehabilitation.
Second chances.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and Dr. Adshead kind of dives right into this by asking a big question. Can we actually change violent minds?
That's a really good question, and it's not just theoretical for her, is it? I mean, she spent almost 40 years working in prisons and psychiatric hospitals,
Right.
talking to people who've committed violent acts.
Yeah, so
she's got a lot of experience to draw on.
she's coming at this with a ton of experience.
That's amazing. So how does she kick things off?
She starts with a kind of lighthearted story about this woman who had brain surgery.
Okay.
And after the surgery, guess what? She decides she's not interested in housework anymore.
Wait, what? Brain surgery changes your feeling about chores.
Exactly. Might sound funny,
Yeah.
but it illustrates this crucial point. Humans can actually change their minds about things,
Yeah.
even stuff that we think is deeply ingrained.
Okay, so if we can change our minds about housework, maybe we can change them about violence too. But how?
Well, Dr. Adshead acknowledges that just locking people up isn't the most effective solution.
Right.
She points out that the UK spends billions of pounds every year on prisons.
Wow.
But longer sentences don't really deter crime that much.
Yeah.
It's not a huge deterrent.
So it makes you wonder if that money could be better spent.
Right,
like that.
exactly. That's where rehabilitation comes in.
Oh.
And Dr. Adshead highlights some really promising research about interventions that actually work, especially for young offenders convicted of serious violence.
Tell me more about these interventions. What are they actually doing?
One example she gives is something called prison therapeutic communities.
Prison therapeutic communities.
Have you heard of those?
I haven't. What are they like?
So in these communities, the focus is on getting prisoners to reflect on themselves, understand where their violent behavior comes from,
Okay.
and learn how to build healthy relationships.
Right.
It's not about punishment, it's about helping them change their thinking and their behavior.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about addressing the root causes, not
Yeah.
just locking them up and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
Do we have any real-world examples of this working?
Dr. Adshead actually talks about this prisoner named Luke,
Okay.
who killed someone while he was on drugs and possibly mentally ill.
Wow.
Initially, he found therapy really tough, but eventually he started to grasp the importance of trust
Okay.
and began to express genuine remorse for what he did.
That's powerful. It shows that even in the toughest cases, there's hope for change.
Right. And it highlights how important it is to provide the right kind of support. It's not about condoning the violence, but understanding where it comes from
Yeah.
and helping people find a different path.
So we've got these prison therapeutic communities. Are there any other examples of programs that are doing this kind of work?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Dr. Adshead also spotlights Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles.
Homeboy Industries. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's the largest gang rehabilitation program in the world.
Wow.
And their approach is all about radical acceptance and compassion.
Radical acceptance. That sounds pretty, radical.
It might sound unusual,
Yeah.
but it's incredibly effective.
Okay.
They offer former gang members hope, practical support, and a chance to reconnect with society. They help them build new lives and break free from that cycle of violence.
So they're not just focusing on the individual, they're also looking at the bigger picture, the social factors that contribute to violence.
Exactly. And this aligns perfectly with what the World Health Organization says about preventing violence. They emphasize things like preventing childhood trauma and supporting mental health.
Okay.
It's about creating environments where people feel safe and supported,
Yeah.
which can potentially stop violence before it even starts.
That's a really interesting point. It's not just about reacting to violence after it happens, but trying to prevent it in the first place, like getting ahead of it.
And it makes you think about how much of our focus on crime is reactive rather than proactive.
Right.
Dr. Adshead also talks about restorative justice.
Okay, restorative justice.
Yeah. Which is a completely different way of thinking about justice.
I've heard a little about that. Can you break it down for our listeners? What is restorative justice all about?
So imagine instead of focusing on punishment,
Okay.
we bring victims and offenders together in a safe and structured environment They have a chance to talk to each other,
Wow.
to hear each other's perspectives, and potentially even forgive each other.
That must be incredibly intense.
It is, yeah.
Do we have an example from the lecture?
Dr. Adshead talks about this man named Kenny who killed his mother while he was mentally unwell.
Oh, wow.
And through restorative justice, he was able to meet with his grieving father. It was a painful but essential conversation
Yeah.
that allowed them to begin to process what happened
Right.
and maybe even start to heal.
That's a really powerful example. It shows that even in the most tragic situations, there's potential for understanding and even healing.
Exactly. And it challenges us to rethink what justice really means. Is it about punishment and retribution, or is it about finding ways to repair the harm that's been done and move forward?
It sounds like Dr. Adshead is suggesting that maybe we need to shift our focus away from punishment and towards healing and rehabilitation.
Right. And she points to Norway as an example of a country that's trying to do just that. Norway consistently ranks high on the World Happiness Index.
The Happy Vikings.
Right. But here's the interesting part. They also have lower incarceration and recidivism rates compared to a lot of other countries.
So maybe there's a link between happiness and a more rehabilitative approach to crime. It makes you think about what kind of society we want to create.
Absolutely. And Dr. Adshead emphasizes that having well-trained prison staff is key to making rehabilitation programs work.
Right. You can't just throw people in prison and expect them to change without any support or guidance.
Right. She compares the UK's limited training for prison officers to Norway's comprehensive 2-year program.
2 years.
Where officers get both academic and practical training.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
And it shows how seriously Norway takes the role of prison officers in helping people turn their lives around.
So in Norway, prison officers are seen as like agents of change.
Yeah.
Not just guards.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. So it seems like Norway has a lot to teach us about how to approach crime and punishment in a more humane and effective way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not always easy to embrace a more compassionate approach, especially when we're talking about violent crimes. Dr. Adshead brings up the very human emotion of revenge.
Yeah, revenge. It's hard to let go of that anger and desire for retribution.
It is.
But she argues that inflicting suffering on prisoners doesn't really achieve justice or reduce future violence.
Yeah. Exactly. She challenges the audience, and us, to think about what we would want if someone we loved committed a terrible crime.
That's a really thought-provoking question. I think most of us would want our loved ones to have a chance at redemption, not just to be punished. We'd want them to understand the impact of their actions and become better people.
Right, and that brings us to Dr. Adshead's central question. What kind of people do we want to be, both as individuals and as a society? Do we want to be driven by fear and revenge, or by compassion and a belief in the possibility of change?
That's a powerful question. It makes you examine your own values and how you view the world.
Definitely. And then the lecture shifts to a Q&A session with the audience. And it seems like even in Norway, there are some challenges to this rehabilitative approach.
Oh, interesting.
A member of the Norwegian parliament brings up the issue of rising crime rates, especially among young people.
So even in a country known for its progressive approach, there are concerns about whether rehabilitation is still effective.
Exactly.
Especially when it comes to public safety.
And this parliament member even suggests that maybe a tougher stance is needed to maintain public trust in the justice system. It's a reminder that even in a place like Norway, there's a constant balancing act between rehabilitation and accountability.
Right. It's not a simple issue. There's a tension between wanting to give people a second chance and ensuring public safety.
Absolutely. And Dr. Adshead addresses this head-on. She points out that research actually shows that locking up teenagers doesn't prevent them from reoffending.
Interesting.
In fact, it often makes things worse.
So the tough-on-crime approach might actually be counterproductive.
It seems that way. Dr. Adshead argues that what these young people need is support, education, and opportunities to heal.
Right.
Not just punishment. She also emphasizes that we need to be careful about lumping all crimes and offenders together. Not every crime is the same, and different situations require different approaches.
So a one-size-fits-all approach to criminal justice just doesn't work.
Exactly. The conversation then turns to domestic violence. And a psychologist working with a program for male perpetrators raises a really thought-provoking question. Why are we so focused on protecting women instead of addressing the men's violence?
That's such a good point. Why is it always up to the women to change their lives and find safety, while the men who are causing the harm get to stay put? It feels like the system is protecting the status quo instead of actually tackling the problem.
And Dr. Adshead agrees. She suggests that it might be more effective to remove the men from their homes and make them participate in treatment programs that specifically address their violent behavior.
That's a bold idea, but is there evidence that it works?
Dr. Adshead highlights that many men who engage in domestic violence have a history of trauma themselves.
Yeah.
And there are actually effective ways to help them learn to manage their emotions and develop healthier relationship patterns. It's not about excusing their behavior, but understanding where it comes from and giving them the tools to change.
Sounds like there's a lot of potential there. Then things take a more somber turn as a survivor of the 2011 U2 attack shares his experience. It's a chilling reminder of the devastating impact of ideologically motivated violence and how difficult rehabilitation can be in these cases.
It's a heavy moment. The survivor, Magnus Håkansson, talks about the importance of holding on to his dignity and principles, even after experiencing such a horrific act of violence.
Wow.
He makes a really powerful statement about refusing to respond to hate with more hate, choosing instead to uphold compassion and justice.
That's incredible to have that kind of strength after going through something so traumatic. What a powerful message. Did he have any thoughts on how the justice system could better address these kinds of situations?
He actually raises a really challenging question. How do we create penal systems that both acknowledge the needs of survivors and work towards rehabilitating and reintegrating offenders?
That's a tough one. How do you balance those two seemingly conflicting goals?
Dr. Adshead acknowledges that there isn't an easy answer. She stresses the need for dialogue and collaboration, both within and across countries, to find ways to address the growing problem of terrorism and ideologically motivated violence.
It's a global issue that requires a global response.
Exactly, and it's a conversation that forces us to confront our own biases, to understand the complex factors that contribute to violence, and to be willing to challenge our assumptions about what justice looks like.
Then, a data scientist in the audience brings up a question that's been kind of weaving through the whole lecture series. What about the role of childhood trauma and family instability in predicting violent behavior?
Yeah.
Good question.
He wants to know if there's enough emphasis on early intervention and support for families as a way to prevent violence.
Yeah, it goes back to that idea of preventing violence before it even starts.
Right. And Dr. Adshead agrees that early intervention is absolutely crucial, especially for children experiencing neglect and emotional abuse, which research has shown are strong predictors of later violence.
It seems like investing in support for families would be a much more effective approach in the long run.
She makes the argument that it's not just morally the right thing to do, but it's also economically sound. It's about preventing a much larger problem down the road.
Prevention rather than a reaction. So the interviewer, Anita Anand, wraps up the lecture by asking Dr. Adshead if, after a lifetime of working with violent offenders, she's optimistic about the future. What's her response?
She gives a resounding yes.
That's great.
She sees a growing interest in understanding and addressing the root causes of violence. Moving beyond simplistic solutions like punishment and isolation. It's a message of hope and possibility, even when we're dealing with some really tough challenges.
That's encouraging. It sounds like there's a shift happening in how we think about violence and how to address it.
Right. And to end the lecture, Dr. Adshead shares a memory of a pivotal moment in her career when she realized that even the most violent individuals have the capacity for change.
Tell me about it. What was this moment?
She describes working with a man who had committed a really brutal assault. And she talks about the profound impact of seeing him engage in therapy and start to reflect on his actions.
It's a powerful reminder that change is possible, even in the darkest of circumstances. And that brings us to the end of this incredible series of lectures.
It's been a deep dive into the complex and often unsettling world of violence, but also a journey of discovery, revealing the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the potential for change that exists within each of us.
So listeners, what are your thoughts on all of this? We've covered a lot of ground, from the limitations of traditional punishment to the potential of restorative justice and the importance of early intervention.
We've seen that change is possible, even for those who've committed terrible acts. But it requires a shift in our thinking, a willingness to move beyond fear and vengeance and embrace a more compassionate and understanding approach.
It's a challenge, for sure. But it's also an opportunity to create a more just and peaceful world. So we want to hear from you. What resonated with you the most? What questions are you left with?
Let's keep this conversation going. Share your thoughts on social media, join online forums, talk to your friends and family. Let's work together to create a world where violence is no longer the answer.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's not just about listening to these lectures, it's about taking action in our own lives.
Right, and I'm curious about what that looks like. What kind of action can we take?
Exactly. It could be volunteering with an organization that supports people who've been in prison or advocating for changes in how we sentence people.
Right, or even just having more open-minded conversations about crime and punishment with our friends and family.
Absolutely. It's about changing hearts and minds one conversation at a time.
So true, and maybe that's how we start building a society that's both safer and more just.
Yeah, a society that recognizes that everyone has worth and deserves dignity, even those who've made serious mistakes.
It's a vision worth working towards, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I think Dr. Adshead's lectures give us some great tools and insights to help us along the way.
So if we're talking about changing minds and offering second chances, what does that look like for really extreme cases like terrorism?
That's a really important question, and it's one that Norway is grappling with directly.
You're right, they've got that tragic history with Anders Breivik and the 2011 Utøya attack.
Right. Even though Breivik's crimes were absolutely horrific, Norway's still committed to upholding his human rights within the prison system.
Which is a pretty bold stance considering what he did.
Exactly. It speaks to how deeply ingrained the idea of human rights is in Norwegian society.
But it also raises some really tough questions, right?
Definitely. Like, how do you balance the need for rehabilitation with keeping the public safe from someone who's committed such a terrible act?
Yeah, it's like you believe in second chances, but how do you do that when someone's actions have been so devastating?
Exactly. And how do you make sure the justice system considers the needs and concerns of survivors and the families of victims? It's a delicate balancing act.
And with ideologically motivated violence like Breivik's attack, it gets even more complicated.
Because you're not just dealing with an individual's behavior, you're dealing with the ideology that fueled it.
Right, so it becomes about preventing that ideology from spreading, which is a whole other challenge.
It requires a multifaceted approach that includes education, community engagement, and addressing the social and political conditions that lead to extremism.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is, but the conversation in Norway suggests that there's a real dedication to finding solutions that are both effective and humane.
That commitment to human dignity no matter what is something we can all learn from, don't you think?
Absolutely. It boils down to what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we're all capable of both good and evil.
And that we have a responsibility to create a world where everyone has a chance to heal, grow, and contribute to society.
It's a tall order, but Dr. Adshead's lecture reminds us that it's a journey worth taking.
Right, and don't underestimate the power of even small acts of kindness and compassion.
They can have a ripple effect, creating a more just and peaceful world.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe Norway's example can inspire other countries to rethink their approach to criminal justice and invest in systems that prioritize rehabilitation and restoration.
It's definitely a hopeful thought. It reminds us that change is always possible if we're willing to embrace it.
So what do you think, listeners? What kind of world do we want to create?
And what role can each of us play in making that vision a reality?
These are the big questions Dr. Adshead leaves us to think about.
They're not easy questions, but they're definitely worth asking.
Yeah, and they highlight the importance of this whole series of lectures.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive into violence, but also into the human potential for change and growth.
And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a better future.
So let's keep this conversation going. Let's challenge our assumptions, learn from others, and work together to build a world where violence isn't the answer.
It starts with us. What choices will we make? What actions will we take?
It's time to move beyond simply listening and start taking action.
Because the world needs more than just passive observers. It needs people who are willing to stand up and make a difference.
So let's get out there and make that difference.
Yeah, it's a powerful call to action.
It really is. And, she's not just talking to policymakers and people in the justice system. She's talking to all of us.
Exactly. She's saying it's not enough to just listen to these lectures. We have to actually do something with what we've learned.
Right. And what does that look like? What can we do?
Well, there's so many ways you could volunteer with an organization that helps people who've been in prison or advocate for changes in how we sentence people.
Okay. Or even just start having more compassionate conversations with our friends and family about crime and punishment.
Absolutely. It's about changing hearts and minds one conversation at a time.
And maybe, just maybe by shifting our focus from punishment to rehabilitation, we can create a society that's both safer and more just.
Yeah, a society that recognizes that every human being has inherent worth and dignity, even those who've made terrible mistakes.
It's a beautiful vision, and I think Dr. Adshead's lectures have given us some valuable tools and insights to help us on that journey.
Absolutely.
So let's continue this conversation, listeners. Let's challenge our own assumptions and learn from other countries, and let's work together to create a world where violence is no longer the answer.
And that concludes our review of the 2024 BBC Reith lectures. Tune in tomorrow for the unbelievable story of Frank Ebigale, whose story inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can, starring Leonardo DiCaprio.